All right, I forgot I was traveling this week, so I went ahead and pre-recorded a Wednesday live stream. So I'll pick up the live streams next week, but I made a few changes to the package that we started building last week, and let's just kind of recap those, and then we'll jump in and keep coding. So, whoa, let's not zoom in, shall we? Okay, so yeah, let's jump out to GitHub. Basically, I made some additional commits, cleaned up the README file. The build itself is now passing. It's linting. It's making sure there's no syntax errors, making sure the code style is there with Pint. It runs a bunch of tests for all the various versions that this package should support. I probably don't need to do so many just to have this complete a little faster. That's a bit long, but anyway, I'll clean that up maybe off stream before I go. The status helper is out there and fully tested. So let's go take a look where we left off last time. We had written this helper bit here, kind of the unit test, but we hadn't written the more feature or integration style test. So this actually loads up and tests the helper and basically makes sure that if we call it with no arguments, we get back an instance of that HTTP status class. And then if we do call it with arguments, it uses those status codes to set an illuminate response and give that back to you. So just same as kind of the other test with some data helpers. And basically, in this case, instead of a runtime exception for calling a method that doesn't exist on that, I have this invalid argument exception. Well, I'm thinking that, is there such thing as an invalid method? Invalid? No, there's not. Okay. I was just thinking for the other one, is there a way to say like invalid method? But like, I'm sure there's probably like a invalid method call or something like method call not allowed or something like that. But I think the runtime exception is fine for now. Anyway, tweaked the upgrade guide, tweaked the README file, and basically just kind of warning that this is a whip right now. I also remembered the other little feature that I wanted to do, so let me just throw it into this to-do that's still kind of floating out here. I basically wanted like a find by star for models. And this, I'll explain this more in a future stream, but I have these little helper find methods in my applications a lot. So for example, Shift has like a find by SKU, right? And it's just a quick way to get a shift by the SKU that I know it has, like 11 is the Laravel 11 shift, and that just allows me to pluck it from the database. So instead of saying like, shift : where SKU, comma, 11, arrow first, I like this little find by thing. And that's actually from my time as a Rails developer. They have a lot of find by, and I'm pretty sure they might still be. I don't know. I was writing Rails like Rails 3, Rails 4. I think they're on like 7 or 8 now. So, but if I remember right at the time, find by star was legit in Rails. Like you didn't have to build these methods. That's just kind of how Rails worked, I believe. Again, this is like 15 years ago. So forgive me if you're a Rails developer and I got that wrong, but I want to build something similar for Laravel is the simple way to say it. So we'll probably do that 2 or 3 live streams from now. Today, I wanted to backfill this because this was another one that I did try to PR. So most of this code's written. Let's just kind of bring it over into this like we did with the status method and then, or the status helper. We'll bring this over and then, maybe I'll look into writing a test or two for it. This might be a little bit tricky because technically you would want to throw this on a policy. So I'd have to figure out how to do that with test bench. I'd have to figure out how to do that test bench where you actually like it like auto-discovered policies or something and you had a model. I may look into that off stream and we'll go back and add a legitimate test for it after the fact. But let's pull over the code. So again, if you've watched a previous stream, you remember when I was doing these like Laravel 12 hacks, I still have this code floating in here. So what I want to do is I want to have a policy. And the original PR was basically to add a fallback method. The fallback method would allow you to say, hey, if the ability was view any, then do this. Otherwise, do the standard user ID matches comment user ID, right? I feel like policies can be, very repetitive. All of the methods are pretty much repetitive. Like you have two groups of methods. You have the methods that are without models, which typically you just return true from. And then you have the methods with the model where you want to compare their, foreign keys together, right? So like, that's all these are ever doing. And it's so much code, and it really only does two things. It's either like return true or return the model IDs match. So I thought like this fallback method would be nice to just have a single method where that could just get like packed down and you could communicate, hey, I'm using with fallback. So that's what I want to build. Instead of formalizing a fallback method similar to before in Laravel that got closed, we can just recreate it. Actually, we found in the previous stream with this call magic method in Laravel, or in PHP, not Laravel. Laravel uses it a lot, but it's a PHP method. Okay, so let's pull this code over. And I think we kind of landed on that stream with like use with fallback. That feels a little Laravel-ish with fallback. Like I have a policy and it's using a fallback. That feels in the ballpark of the correct wording that you would kind of feel in Laravel. So I'm gonna make a new file called traits with fallback.php, and let's bring this over. Well, we can't do that now, can we? We can say trait with fallback, and let's bring that over, and now we can do this. Okay, so here's what we want to do. It helps if you namespace stuff, probably. So namespace JMac additions traits. There you are. Okay, cool. So what does this need to do? So by the rules of this method, you're always going to get name and then an array of arguments. Now, what's very, very interesting about this is the way in which this is going to get called heavily depends on Laravel. So we're going to need to dig into Laravel to look at kind of how this would end up getting called. My guess is we would really probably just string those back out. But there were a few things. Yeah, okay, it looks like I still have these comments. Looks like I still have these comments here. Okay. Yeah. Okay, let's write this out. Okay, so first, need to ensure there is a fallback method, right? Now keep in mind, Laravel's not going to know about this fallback method. That was the original idea, was it would just be built into Laravel, but that was closed. I tried that PR, it's closed. So we're recreating it with this trait, but you would still need to put the fallback method in your policy. You have to define it. If you don't define it, but you said you use with fallback, then we probably need to throw again, a runtime exception. So we can basically say if method exists on this, and the method is fallback, if not exists, then we would throw a new runtime exception. You must define a fallback method when using the with fallback trait. All right, we can clean that up in the real world, but that basically takes care of that. Okay, so this got called. We know that there's a fallback method on whoever's using this trait, right? And then, yeah, this is an instance method, so we should have access to this. It's possible that, yeah, it's possible that like they might do something like static here. But I think this is probably the way to go. I could scour like the framework code base for method exists and kind of see if they follow that suit. But again, I think that would work is the point. Okay, the other thing, again, since we're not calling this method directly, Laravel is calling it thinking that it's, view any or store or whatever, right? It's thinking it's one of the policy methods or the ability's name. And what happened is Laravel actually camel cases the ability name. Now this is a bit tricky. Because they camel case it and they pass it down, it's potentially not going to match what you originally called the ability. So let me do a few examples here. Let's say you have gate, authorize, right? And you say read comment or something like that, and you pass it in a user, or a post is probably more likely, okay? What happens underneath is Laravel takes this ability name and turns it into read comment. It looks for a method underneath called read comment. Now, I could make that assumption and split it back up, right? I could uncamel case it, to go back to read comment. And in this case, that's good, right? But consider another example where someone actually did an initial camel case, right? Or did like all caps here, like read, they did Pascal case or whatever that's called, like read comment post. I'm going to take this read comment and turn it into that. And that's not what the original ability name was. So because this is not built into Laravel, unfortunately, I don't think I'm ever really going to be able to reliably know what the ability name was. We'd have to look at Laravel's code, but I don't think I'm ever going to reliably know what the ability name was. Because again, this name is the name of the method they attempted to call. And it receives the arguments that Laravel would have passed that method, not the original arguments that you called this with. So yeah, because of that, it's a little bit tough. You have two options here. You have two options. We could slugify the name again, or dasherize the name, whatever you want to call it. We could go this route. And then you would document and say, hey, the name you receive on what's called is a slugified or dasherized version of the original ability name. You just have to communicate which direction you want to go. Or you can say, fallback receives the name of the method that would have been called, not the ability name. Again, you just have to communicate it, but it's kind of choosing like what's going to be the most natural. It'll be documented either way, but part of me feels like the most natural is to probably slugify it. Because I think in most real world apps this would end up lining up, and it wouldn't be that jarring. Whereas like if someone called this read comment and we dasherized it, it's a pretty easy dump if you're debugging. I got a dasherized name. Oh, okay, whatever. And then maybe they check the docs and it's like, oh yeah, you get a dasherized name. Like, oh, okay, duh. Like maybe for 2 or 3 minutes that's going to be annoying, but then you learn and it's no big deal ever again. So versus I think if you went camel case, it's kind of like, why am I always getting the camel case name? Said another way, you get a better hit rate that this is going to end up being right if you dasherize it. Whereas I don't think that's probably a very common real world naming convention for ability names. Most of the docs ability names, go dasherized when they're custom. And again, the 7 resource methods out of the box are, you don't even have to say what it is, right? You just say index whatever. So to that point, let's bring up the Laravel authorization. Let's go look at the policies. Writing gates, generating policies. Okay, yeah, we make a policy. Yeah, so you just say, when you call this, I was trying to see where they named the methods. Yeah, so it's just update. Here you go, view any, blah, 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 blah. You don't actually, yeah, when you gate this, you don't actually you just call authorize update, and you call the name. Yeah, okay, so you would say gate authorize view any post, and view any would be a capital A any. So that would line up, but if I dasherized it, it would be view dash any. I don't know how I feel about that. I don't know how I feel about that. I think for now I'm going to leave the name alone. When in doubt, just bail out. You're not. Yeah, let's not worry about the name right now. It's not worth it. Okay, so what's going to happen is, I think what I'm going to do is call this method. Okay, and then the whole thing might be as simple as this. You basically return whatever fallback says. Could be null. That's acceptable. Null's acceptable. That gets handled internally. It automatically strips class name argument for methods without models. Create, store. Yeah. Okay. So model. Again, this gets okay. So here's probably what needs to happen. What you probably need to do is you probably need to say model equals array I don't think you can do array shift. Yeah, that's where it gets weird. You have, okay, let me explain the thinking here. This is pretty dense. That's why I really wanted it in core. It's doable, but we kind of have to unpack some of the stuff that Laravel's done underneath to give fallback the things it would need to do the right job, right? You can't just straight give it arguments. That's not what a policy method kind of expects. It would be nice to give the fallback method, again, originally it'd be nice to give the fallback method the ability name, the potential model that is supposed to be passed in, for example, things like update, and then additional arguments. But that's not really how it it's not so easy. So let's take a look at this. Basically what you would say is you would say if arguments, so if arguments 0, let's just say this, if first argument is a model, then, see, this isn't even universal. Let's just work it out. So then pop to be the comparison model. It's tough. By comparison model, I mean this. So, see, update gets user and post. This is what update would get automatically. But now, because of the magic method call, this is inside of arguments as the first and second argument. Inside of arguments. So that this is element 1 and element 2, or 0 and 1, if we're thinking about indices. But the point is that the first element in there in arguments that we get, in this case, if you're called this way, just to kind of map this out. So a real world call is if you called update like this, right? If you called gate update, then this call method would ultimately, name would be update, and arguments would be user and post. Now, ideally, what would happen is fallback would get the original name, update, it would get user, it would get post, and then it would get additional arguments that you might have passed into update. That's ideally what it should do. The problem is, you can call so many other methods with this. So like, there's a lot of other methods you could call on this. You could have, theoretically, you could have it works for any policy. So like theoretically, you could have any method name and any set of arguments to pass into it. So it's like, how do I know which one's the user and which one's the model to kind of split that up? What I'm trying to avoid is for this method to be too dense. I don't want it to be so dense that you have to be aware of how the gate facade worked for you before you got called at the fallback method. I want the fallback method to feel, if we go back to the hacks, like I want the fallback method to feel like I can say something like ability, user, model, and then, arguments, right? And I want this to feel like I can say something like, okay, if ability was equal to view any, then, return true. Otherwise, if ability was, let's just say something like update, then I would effectively, return user arrow ID is equal to model arrow user ID, right? Like this would be like a real world way in which I would pack down this whole, this whole policy, would be that simple. I would say this fallback, this, and the default, is just return null, right? Or you could just say return false, like you're not authorized. So if you view any true, if it's update, you got to match, all done. Otherwise, you say like whatever you want. The problem is from the magic method's perspective, it's not as clean. It doesn't know that it's getting user and model. In the PR for Laravel, I was at the gate, so I had access to ability, user, and model, and I could just pass it in directly. But from call, if we go back to Laravel additions, from call, it's like you just get an array of arguments now, and now I have to make the assumption I could do, I could do some stuff. I could do something and say like if name is equal to create, then it's like user model whatever. Like I know what has to get passed into those methods. And then anything else is just everything's in arguments. Like user and model is not set. I could do that, right? I could say, yeah, models without methods, guest users. Okay, so yeah, see, you could even have a guest user. So you could be passed in null there. I wonder how they do that. There we go. By default, all gates and policies automatically return false if the incoming HTTP is not okay. However, you may allow these authorization checks to pass. I'm actually not going to worry about that because you actually have to type hint. Yeah. Or supplying a default value for the user. Yeah. Yeah. I think if you required this level, you're going to have to define the method. So again, with fallback, it's going to have a handful of restrictions. It's kind of for the common use case of like you've got a pretty common model policy and these methods all behave the same way simply by checking the foreign key, right? For example, you may define view or delete methods to utilize various post-related actions. Okay, so you may continue to define additional methods on the policy as needed for the various actions it authorizes. For example, you might define view or delete methods to authorize various post-related actions. But remember, you are free to give your policy method any name you like. Hold on, I'm having a bit of a eureka moment here. Hold on a second. Let's go back to Laravel 12. PHP artisan make policy. What do you pass it? -- model. Okay, so we could say something like example policy -- model equals user. All right, let's go look at this. I just want to go look at this example policy. What does it generate for me? Yeah, okay, it generates all of them. What I'm curious about is if you were to pass additional arguments, to one of these methods, does it come in as arguments, or does this last thing become arguments? I kind of feel like I remember the last thing becomes arguments. Let's take a look. Additional, what's this? Yeah, here you go. Okay. When authorizing actions using policies, you may pass an array as the second argument to the various authorization functions and helpers. The first element in the array will be used to determine which policy should be invoked, while the rest of the array elements are passed as parameters to the policy method and can be used for additional context. For example, consider the following additional policy. Okay, so boom, boom, boom. All right, when attempting to determine, okay, I see. So these get unpacked. You automatically get user, post comes in, and category comes in. It's like I'd kind of need to, I think we're going to have to fire up test bench. I think we're going to have to get test bench running with all the various different tests, right? Let's do this. Let's end on, this one was a bit tougher than I thought. We could brute force it. Like we could brute force it and say, okay, create, here's the parameters that you get called with, these methods, update method, we could brute force it with just a big old if statement here if we really wanted, if create, here's how you call fallback, if whatever, here's how you call. Otherwise, you call fallback with a bunch of arguments and null as the model and user. And again, it's just documented as that's the behavior. Like if you call the policy, if you call the resourceful policy methods, it's going to split everything up. Otherwise, maybe it just makes a best effort to say, okay, is your first argument, an authorizable, contract? Like, is it an instance of authorizable or whatever the user model is, right? And then is the next thing a model, eloquent model? Okay, split those out, and then everything else is arguments. Like, we could do the same thing. But I think, so I think what needs to happen is determine, shifting arguments to fallback, right? So let's take this out. And then I just want to kind of define some use cases, right? So the use case is, the common use case is basically the policy methods. So you have, resourceful methods with user and model. And then you basically have the resourceful methods without model. We're definitely not going to cover a guest thing. I think you need to define that on your own. If you're allowing a guest for a very specific thing that otherwise wouldn't have a guest, I don't think there's anything we can really do here. Okay, so then we have the resourceful method with user and model, resourceful methods without model. And then you have any method. And then basically we have with additional arguments. So with additional arguments. And then it's like the real kicker would be, non-resourceful methods. Yeah, non-resourceful methods with additional arguments. That's the hard one right there. I think both of these are probably really hard, but I think if it's a resourceful method, worst case scenario, we could just brute force it with, 2 or 3 if statements. This is the one where it gets a little interesting. Like, what do you do there? Do you just pass everything as arguments? Do you call fallback with like this ... argument notation and let it just kind of splat out? Like, I don't know. I don't know what you do there. We're gonna need to drive this out with some test cases. So I think what I'm gonna do is stop here. We'll also get some audience feedback. I think that's also where there's a little back and forth here. I think there's a lot of questions on how this should work. So I think having some audience feedback in a future real live stream and not pre-recorded is probably the way to go. So I think we have the trait. We know you have to have a fallback method. Now it's kind of just making sure the DX is really what you would expect within that fallback method. Again, the whole point here is to streamline your code and make it easier. And we've definitely achieved the streamlining. But if this is like so dense on what you actually get in fallback, where it's easier just to write the other thing, then it doesn't really have a lot of value. Then the DX fails, right? So we really need to dial in that DX for this to be worth it. Like, you can make the assumption that anyone using this package is probably already like kind of a power user of Laravel, right? Because, the policy methods are fine. There's nothing wrong with them. Again, this is just an optimization. If you write a lot of them, you might like this trait. So I think you're willing to accept a few trade-offs in that regard. But again, we just need to make sure they're really communicated. They're communicated well. They're documented well. But ideally remove as much of them as possible, even if it means having a lot more code right here. It needs to look and feel the way, the way in which you would kind of expect. Like if we go back to Laravel 12, like we want this fallback method to, to feel kind of like this. We want to get, basically we want to achieve this signature. That's the signature we want. Now, whether or not, this is null or whatever, that's kind of up to you. But we basically want to be able to satisfy this signature and fill in those blanks as best we can. That's the goal of the magic method. It needs to unpack what Laravel would have given this method had it really existed and treated it like any one of these, right? We need this. We need it to behave that way, I think, to be fully valuable. So I'm going to think on it some more. I'm going to get Orchestra running where we can actually have a policy and a model and it all wires up, and we can actually, in our test, call gate and see that our test policy using this fallback method works the way we expect. So I need to do some off-stream work to see if all that can actually get wired up, because I think that's going to be important to kind of drive those test cases out. So anyway, thanks everybody for watching, even though it wasn't live. Appreciate it, and it will be live next Wednesday.